And whoever wins, they are going to have a fragmented parliament first. But second, yes, this is a 50-50, but it looks like a geographical vote and a fear vote.
Welcome to another edition of Sustainability LATAM. Today we're talking about Peru, and we're talking about 0.23%, which is the gap separating the two rival presidential candidates after last Sunday's elections. Our listeners will have an advantage that by the time you hear this, you probably will have found a resolution, and either Keiko Fujimori of the populist right or Roberto Sanchez of a slightly more traditional left will have been proclaimed victor. But that's yet to come. We'll try and analyze how we're going to get there and what the implications are for Peruvian politics and economics in the next 40 minutes or so, helped by Julian Seydoux, who's an economist and Latin America specialist, and Alberto Souviron, who's a journalist and also a specialist on Bolivia and other Andean countries. So I think I'll start off with Alberto and ask him the $1 million question: who's going to win, and what will the political consequences be for the next government?
Hi, Andrew. Hi, Julian. Thank you. Yeah, definitely that's the $1 million questions. Actually, I would put in this. I'm not surprised. If something this result so far is showing is that anything can happen in Peru. And it's something that, if you remember in our past episodes on Sustainable Latam, we spoke that anything can happen in Peru because it's so fragmented, it's so uncertain that you really don't know what is going on. At first view, you can see a country divided by 50-50, and you can speak of polarization, but that's not the case. Actually, I think that's a confirmation of the fragmentation in the country. If you see that the two candidates who went to the second round, Keiko Fujimori and Roberto Sanchez, between the two, they got no more than less than 30% of support in the first round. And whoever wins, they are going to have a fragmented parliament first. But second, yes, this is a 50-50, but it looks like a geographical vote and a fear vote. My reading on this is people are voting against Fujimori or pro-Fujimori, or against Roberto Sanchez or pro-Roberto Sanchez, which represents an alternative left. And I think all left in Peru, that's go. The other interesting things to see is the geographical division. The South, that is clearly anti-Fujimori, has voted massively for Roberto Sanchez. But in Lima, certain areas of the coast and in the north, Fujimori has strong support. So that shows the regional divide. Still a surprise that the economy of Peru is performing well with all these uncertainties. But one of the things that I'm seeing is that the next government, whoever wins, is going to have a problem of legitimacy from the beginning. So they will need to think in some kind of unique solution or build bridges, which is so far has been probably the weakest point in Peruvian politics.
Alberto, I want to jump in here just to remind our listeners of what you were telling me a few minutes ago. As we speak, what we know are that balloting station returns have to be counted, and they seem to hold the balance of who will win and who will lose. And the various types of returns, there are some that have been observed. They might have some technical irregularity, but they need to be assessed. There are those that come in from distant rural areas, which are thought to be generally pro-Sanchez, pro the left, and there are those, and this is what we were talking about, that come in from Peruvians resident overseas, where traditionally Keiko Fujimori supporters seem to be in larger numbers. So we were talking about the strange paradox that the determining factor in choosing a Peruvian president may be a voter in Miami or a voter in Madrid. And what does that say about the legitimacy of the elected president?
Exactly. Is what I'm referring as well. And yes, thank you for reminding me that. Uh, yes, let's put in that way. I think it's the first time that you have to ask yourself is right that the next president of a country, in that case Peru, is being decided by the votes in Miami, Madrid, or another part of the world? That's a good question. I'm not pro or against any of it. It's really difficult to say because, but it's raising at least a legitimacy question,
Yeah.
as you say.
I'm sorry for jumping in yet
Mm.
again.
No, go ahead.
One detail caught my attention, which is the overseas polling booths, usually Peruvian consulates. They don't send the polling station returns. They send all the votes, which have to go back to Peru by the diplomatic bag. And one thing that I've discovered is that a lot of those votes are not due to arrive until tomorrow, Wednesday the 10th of June. So it'll be after that that we start hearing perhaps who the real winner is.
Which confirms what I say at the beginning. What the constant in Peruvian politics is uncertainty. You don't know what is going to happen until the end, literally. So it is. But that raises a lot of questions, actually, of a political system that is a fragmented countries showing a lot of regional divides, divisions between Lima and the rest of the country, and a lot of challenges around. And let's not talk about the geopolitical compete that we always talk about, but internally the country has a lot of challenges ahead. And if you, I mentioned you before when we were talking. I have a good friend who coined this term that is the catastrophical draw, because
Yeah.
none of the sides can impose on the other, and that is generate some kind of paralysis inside the country.
This gives me a good opportunity to switch to Julian and ask him if the markets are seriously concerned by catastrophic draws, or are they much more taking what's happening in Peru in their stride?
Yeah, I don't think there's a wait and see with a being cautious about the tie and what it means, and at this stage, on the one side, this is in contrast with what's happening in Colombia, where the right-wing candidate was ahead, and where you kind of have a semi-euphoria in the markets in the bond market especially. But Peru, I think it will depend about there's a lot of wait and see at the moment. And of course, I think what you mentioned, the tie is what's couple of is like 20,000 votes or so, which is nothing.
Yeah.
And you have all the people from still counting, and then voters from outside of Peru, which account for quite a big number by itself, um, and could potentially bring the results. Knowing the full result may take another month for all we know, and another month is another month of uncertainty, and that's not something that you want as a business person. Uncertainty is the worst thing, and the markets don't like it either. So, the quicker they can close this election, the easier then it becomes for business to continue.
But just to play my frequent role of a terrible pessimist, you could say that one outcome of these elections is a bit like Alberto was saying, a catastrophic continuation of where Peru is right now. And where Peru is right now is that over the last 10 years, the country has had 8 and now 9 presidents taking in this last election. There's been an almost continuous deadlock between successive presidents and successive legislatures. And while there is enormous problems to deal with, problems of violence and criminal activity, problems of inequality of income, low services, health, education, and so on. We have a political system that's not really getting to grips with it. Do you think that investors see that?
But Peru is actually a pretty good place to invest, and even over the past 10 years, and people have been investing, not just private equity has moved in. There's a lot of things. Peru has a lot of parts in South America, lots of resources, and lots of key resources in the new economy which is emerging, led by AI. And AI needs, artificial intelligence needs, and supply chain, and so on. And so Peru has a lot to win. But even if I take the past 10 years or so, growth has just been under 3% or 2.8%. And I think we mentioned that at some stage in the past,
Yeah.
industrial revolution was 1.5%. So we're still this is still pretty decent growth by all respect, despite despite all the problems that you have at the political level. On the economical level, people do business. They just go along with it and manage through whichever government there is, which is in part, I think, reflected in the market reaction so far to what to the tie and simply the fact that even though nothing's called in yet, the left-wing candidate is slightly ahead to the right-wing candidate. So what does it mean? Well, it just means that on the pessimistic, if we were talking about business as usual, I would say that we're still doing pretty well. And plus, in an environment where, generally speaking, on the macro side, there are tailwinds for countries like Peru because of the demands that of all its resources and everything that it has to offer for the international markets and investors and demands from outside. So, and here we're talking mostly about, of course, the US, but also China. And as we mention all the time, and coming back to the more broader view, when you have people, prepared to outbid for your assets, then it increases price. So to some extent, the Peruvian should be able, or the Peru as a country should be able to capture some of the value that is being created by that.
So I'm a little bit confused, and I'm going to ask Alberto to resolve this. What seems to be happening is that I'm saying that the last 10 years in Peru were absolutely terrible. And Julian is saying, referring to investors, oh no, they've been quite good. So are these two things possibly correct at the same time or not? What do you think?
Both are correct. I think Julian put it things. It's a paradox that Peru is performing decently well in economics terms, despite the political uncertainty. And that's a good question. What I put probably as a sound of alarm is the longer this uncertainty gets, I think could be harming the long term of the economy in Peru. But it's something that we have to see. I know that Julian can say, well, let's see the last 10 years, which is quite a long time, and the economy is still doing well. But I was hearing today an analyst from JP Morgan who was saying, yes, Peru is growing probably in the growth in Peru is around 3%. Can you imagine how would this growth in a more stable political country? So in a way, what he was trying to say is it is a little bit of luck that the economy is going really well because Peru has a lot of raw materials that are interesting. But this uncertainty in a way is affecting growth. So it could be even better if it weren't the political instability. But again, these are point of views. One of the things that I always say is fragmentation is not a good thing. And the other question that we have to ask around, and I'm asking myself in this is, why is this fragmentation? It shows two things. One, the rural vote, there is a huge divide between what is the rural vote and the urban vote in Peru that is reflected in other Andean countries. You can see that in Ecuador and you can see that in Bolivia. But in Peru is quite marked sometimes, and it's paralyzing politically the country. That can get worse if there are no way to find some kind of bridges between the two sides. I think that can get worse. The risk for me is that can be turned violent in the long term. And that's probably the challenges that the next governments are going to have. Legitimacy problems, yes, but if we still seen like we have seen in the last 10 years in Peru, one side trying to impose on the another and try to take advantage of the fragmentation in the parliament, which in a way has created a situation of how many presidents in the last 10 years? A lot, basically. 9 presidents in 10 years.
Yeah.
So that situation is not sustainable in time. So they need to sit down on a way and try to find some kind of consensus. But for the moment, this is the big question from my point of view.
Shall we look at the two options, two different presidents? If Roberto Sanchez, who is in the lead with 0.2% of advantage, if Sanchez wins, becomes president, what are the big problems he's likely to face?
I think it's the problems of Fujimori as well. Fear of one half of the country that says what he's going to do, and that's interesting thing to see. Just following a little bit what was the campaign for this second round. Sanchez has moderated his discourse, trying to put some distance from the Castillo's views of the economy, and I think that favors a little bit him in this final round.
Castillo's was the preceding president in 2021, 2022, who led a rather disastrous government.
Exactly. So that's one of the line. But the interesting thing is Sanchez was somebody he used the Castillo symbol, the hat and all the things to go, which helped him to win to get second in the second round, to the second round. But in this second round, from what I see, he moderated the discourse. But that for me is, as Julian said, wait and see what is going to go. But a government of Sanchez, in a way, is going to have the challenge to convince the markets and the economical elite that it's possible to govern and make reforms in a country with a huge levels of inequality. And I think that's the big problem.
He has said that he'll keep on the president of the central bank in an attempt to reassure the markets.
Yeah, but we will see. The problem as well is what is going to do the other actors. With a fragmented parliament, it's going to be difficult. But if he is, again, that's a big if. If he wins, he will need to build some kind of bridges and convince the markets. In the case of Fujimori, it's a little bit different. I think the markets favor, but she would need to build bridges, especially to the south of the country, and says You don't need to fear us. We are trying to be more inclusive and all the things. Again, that shows only the big division of the country.
Psychologically, do you think Keiko is a good person to build bridges? Does she have that sort of negotiating skill and diplomacy to coax, to coax a majority coalition in Congress? Because that's what she will have to do, won't she?
That's a good question. I don't know. You can ask Julian about that. He has a better
Okay,
answer than me.
let's gang up.
Please no, please no. You know, and I don't have much of a view. I just want to come back on an interesting thought about, the political. You were mentioning how many presidents there were and the problems at political level over the past several years. And yes, and it's ideally it's not ideal for economic growth, and yet, as I say, 2.8, 3% for the past 10 years is pretty remarkable still. And yes, possibly if there was more stability, then that would boost growth even more so. But one interesting factor, I think that, for instance, that you may want to consider is that the debt level of Peru, so debt to GDP level of Peru versus all its neighbors, is really, really low. So, it's one of the best performing. I think it's at, I can't remember exactly top of my head, but I'd say something like 35%. And that's pretty remarkable. And that could be as a result of having, conflicting government changing all the time, because no one has time to actually spend any money from that or raise more debt at in the economy. So that could be a safeguard by itself for all we know.
Or I'm afraid I'm taking my pessimistic view. It could be an opportunity for politicians to spend money. So, either Sanchez or Fujimori might say, I'm going to run a big fiscal deficit because there's a bit of headroom
Yeah,
to increase debt, and then seek, popularity and, prolongation in power.
yeah, absolutely. That could be a way. It's one of the one of the only countries, from the rating agency world who's investment grade in Latin America. I mean, it's higher than, again, caveat, but than Brazil, it's higher. So it's from a credit perspective, it looks like a pretty good country, and let alone its southern neighbors, from whether we talk about Bolivia or Argentina, who who are in huge problems, but yeah, I mean, it is potentially, that is something that a new government could consider, of course, as a
Yeah.
populist, something to do. And that goes in line, we talked about, some of the one of the reasons for the blue wave was a crime, and Peru, again, similar to this debt to GDP, its crime levels are, pretty very low in comparison to the entire
Yeah.
region.
Yes, one of the strange things is that Peru has a very low homicide rate, but it is absolutely a hot electoral and political issue. That the average Peruvian believes they're under threat from criminals all the time.
But
I, go ahead.
yes, sorry to interrupting that, Andrew, but here is a thing. That's the problem. Well, what we were talking before is the problem of perception versus reality.
Yeah.
Maybe crime rates are low, which are low if you see, but how people perceive that compared to another time.
Yeah.
Clearly, in Peru, there is a perception that is not the case,
Yeah.
regardless
And
what you say.
to be fair, it may be that journalists and people such as myself are misinterpreting because we're looking at the homicide rate in Peru compared to Brazil and Colombia, and Peru is much lower. But the Peruvian citizen doesn't really care about those comparisons. He or she thinks it's worse than it was 5, 10 years ago. I feel less secure than I felt before, and therefore it is an absolutely legitimate and realistic concern.
Exactly. It's the perception in a way. It has been a driven in these last elections in the first round. I'm not sure how much it has been the driven of the second round. Uh, it's really interesting to see that this technical tie that are the government, the elections in this moment, it's a little bit, from what I heard, about of fear. But it's not fear of crime, it's fear of what one of the candidates are going to do. As I say, I think this has been probably a vote of I vote against the other because I don't want the other. I have fear of the other, whether it is Fujimori or Sanchez. And that has been driving the vote, which is a very irrational way to vote. But
yeah, but here you have this a similar situation than we have to think about the difference in voters from from the city and from the can't remember the word in English, countryside.
Countryside.
Yeah, so from city and countryside, which are reflected, I believe, in the votes. One side votes for one side and the other votes for the other. And so the perception of crime or the perception of the other may be in part linked to the difference between the countryside and the city, and whether countryside people are moving into the city to work or not, and that brings its own new dynamics into the city, and then the fear about being left out. We have to remember that even though in terms of GDP, it's been growing pretty steadily. Half of it, or just under half of the GDP of Peru is generated by Lima and its region. It's very concentrated somewhere, and therefore what that means is that most of the value being generated by Peru is concentrated in this area, which means that you do have quite a lot. It's a big country, a lot of people who may feel, well, how come if we're supposed to be generating that much wealth, how come we're still at GDP per capita of around $8,500, which is not bad in the entire world, but for country growing at the amount it is growing and so on, it's not that great either.
I think you're pointing a very good point in the direction, and I think that the divide is there, the rural votes versus the Lima and concentrating areas, inequality, that there is a bad distribution of the wealth in Peru, and that can be shown through this. It's historical. That's not the last 10 years. I think it's a history.
It's back.
Yeah. But in Peru, it's quite marked. And then comes, and that's a question that I have myself also, some kind of the view or the vision that you have for a country. This rural divide versus the Lima divide also can show a little bit divisions of the vision of how people have seen the people in the Andean areas and the rural areas has a different way of seeing things sometimes, and they feel that they're not being listened or properly represent of the way that they are seeing things. And that can be seen also in the vote and in these divisions. It's not particularly on Peru, but definitely is a reflection in the Andean countries.
I think there's another, it's perhaps too much detail, but there is an issue with Sanchez in that he was a minister in the government of Pedro Castillo, which was eventually removed, but it was a government that was at an incredibly high turnover of ministers, was in office for less than 2 years and achieved very little. So I think it might be a legitimate question to ask whether a Sanchez government would be more disciplined and spend more time diagnosing problems and seeking solutions than happened under Castillo.
Perhaps the question is, did he learn the lessons of Castillo?
Yes.
Try to do it.
Yeah. And I suppose, I mean, the problem with Fujimori is that she hasn't been in government. This was her fourth serious attempt at the presidency. So even though Fujimorismo, as represented by her father in the 1990s, was economically very successful, but was tainted by rather large-scale violations of human rights and authoritarianism. So I suppose what I'm trying to suggest is there are questions about both candidates, and depending which one of them comes through, it'll be interesting to see how politics evolves as a result of that.
Yeah,
I'm conscious we may be getting close to our time.
yeah, we're getting closer to time, but you're saying, well, one thing, uncertainty is probably the main result. Whoever wins is going to this uncertainty is not resolved, and some kind of consensus we need to for the next government. The next government will need to build bridges to generate some kind of consensus. Because if that or forget about democracy, become an authoritarian regime that imposes everything by force, which see in Peru is not necessarily possible to do it. Some governments try to do this and didn't went well. The country is very fragmented. So we will see what is going to happen. One just last thing that I want to mention, and that's more at regional level. It's really interesting to see also and make a comparison with the another election around the corner, which is Colombia.
Yeah.
And the difference between one or the other. The first round in Colombia has clearly polarizations between two visions of the country, the left or the new right with Diaz Pereira, but both with over 40% of support.
Yeah.
Peru, and that's really the interesting thing, is the politics of fragmentations, because even if this government wins, and it doesn't matter that now they are 50-50, in fact is that the real support that they have is less than 30%, which shows the fragmentations and give a lot of challenges. And just on the economic terms, I'm going to follow a little bit what Julian says. Probably the political chaos is good for the economy. In the case of Peru, it has been showing that maybe that's our recipe, but I don't know.
Julian, any last thoughts?
I remember a couple of episodes ago we discussed the upcoming elections, and you asked me who did I think would win, and I said actually I don't know. It seems I'm not the only one who doesn't who the country doesn't know at this present moment. It's gonna be difficult for whoever comes in any case, but you know Peru is resilient. It's been doing fairly well over the past some times. There's some tailwind in the macro effect, so you know as long as they don't squander it too much or there's not too much concentration of this, you know, I remain optimistic about the prospects of Peru generally.
And if I could add to that, I suppose if I were asked, what's your immediate outlook on Peru after the elections? Well, first of all, I'd avoid trying to say who would win because it's within the margin of error and it's terribly difficult to say if it's who will get through. But for a more wider political forecast, I'd say there will be limited bridge building. Whoever is elected will make attempts to build up a majority in Congress, perhaps issue by issue, and and that will be because of the deep fragmentation that Alberto has been mentioning. It will be very difficult to have, if you like, an ambitious political coalition running across left and right. It's more likely that there will be some small gains, and the rest will be a kind of political muddle through, made easier by the reasonably good economic condition that the country is in.
I will end just with the big question that's going to go. The big incognito for me is going to be whoever wins. The question is, will he manage to end his mandate? Because the history of the last 10 years has shown that that's not the case. So we'll see.
With that thought, I'll say goodbye until next time.